Hi, everyone. This week we are recording a little early because our fellowship is getting together in person. So we won't be recording it live with the group. So I wanted to go ahead and get the teaching out there. And this was one, I was talking to a friend that, we started really struggled with, but then it's like as we were talking about things and I started thinking more about it, that I just really sort of started going back through some old notes that I had, and Yah seems like he's starting to piece things together for me. And so this week's study is that. So this week's parsha is called Terumah, which begins in Exodus chapter 25, verse 1. It goes through chapter 27, verse 19. And the parsha this week focuses on the commands for the building of the articles of the tabernacle, or the Mishkan, as it's called in Hebrew. Um, and it begins after Moshe goes up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. And so, as I started looking at the study and thinking about it, when we think about the Mishkan, one of the things that we think about, when we think about a tabernacle or a temple, we think about these sacrifices. And, in one of my women's group, we've been doing a study on the sacrifices. And so there was something interesting, when we're looking at that, because the purpose really wasn't about the the sacrifices. The purpose of the Mishkan was so that Yah could dwell with man. So let's go to Exodus chapter 25 and verse 1. And, as we go through this, we're going to be looking at the Mishkan. We're also going to talk about going back to the Garden of Eden, and we're going to talk about the one new man. So all of this is sort of combined in one here. Exodus chapter 25 and verse 1. And Yah said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel to take up a collection for me, a contribution, accept a contribution from anyone who wholeheartedly wants to give. The contribution you are to take from them is to consist of gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, fine leather, acacia wood, oil for the light, spices for the anointing oil, and for other fragrant incense, the onyx stones and other stones to be set for the ritual vest and the breastplate. They are to make me a sanctuary, a mikdash, so that I may live among them. And you are to make it according to everything I show you, the design of the tabernacle and the design of its furnishings. This is how you are to make it. So, like I said, as you think about the tabernacle and the temple, we tend to think only of those sacrifices. When we think about a sacrifice, what do we think? We think, death. But when you really start going back and looking at the Hebrew mindset and the way they look at it, even today, when you're talking to rabbis and things, they don't use the term in English, sacrifice. They don't like to use that term to describe what they're doing. They will call them korbanot. And the korbanot, because in scripture, that's what it calls them. It calls them a korbanot. And the korbanot has its root, karav. And karav means to draw near. So while, these korbanot, are not really about death, but it's about life. It's about how you draw near to Yah. Um, and so this, got me to thinking and going back through some other stuff. It's like, why should we even really worry about the temple or the tabernacle? We don't have a temple in existence today, so that doesn't matter. Some people say, well, that's just Old Testament. We're the temple, so it doesn't really matter. Our body is the temple. And, but when you think about what the word means, we look at the word temple in English, but the word temple in Hebrew is Beit HaMikdash. Okay. And so it actually means the holy house. Okay. Mikdash. It has kadosh in it. And so, we're saying that this is a holy or set apart house. And as believers, we tend to hear that word holy a lot, and we think about holiness and how, we're to be holy. But if we want to really learn about holy and holiness, then we need to go back and look at where it came from. And, we're over 2,000 years removed from Yah's definition of holiness. And, for example, okay, here's just a prime example of, why we really need to study the Mishkan, the temple, and even these korbanot. So let's go over to Mark. Okay, Mark chapter 5. Yeah, and verse 34. Daughter, he said to her, your trust has healed you. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And while he was speaking, people from the synagogue's official's house came saying, your daughter has died. Why bother the rabbi any longer? Ignoring what they had said, Yeshua told the synagogue official, don't be afraid. Just keep trusting. He let no one follow him except Kepha, Yaakov, and Yochanan, Yaakov's brother. And when they came to the synagogue official's house, he found a great commotion with people weeping and wailing loudly. On entering, he said, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's just asleep. But they jeered at him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and those with him and went in where the child was. So he's going in, and this child is dead. And taking her by the hand, he said to her, and, Talita Kumi, which means, little girl, arise or get up. And at once the girl got up and began walking around. She was 12 years old, and everyone was utterly amazed. So this is just one example. If we go to the passage that's right before that, but I'm going to go and read it in a different version. Let's go to Matthew chapter 9 and verse 20. And this is talking about the woman who has the issue of blood. So a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years approached him from behind and touched the tzitzit on his robe. For she said to herself, if only I can touch his robe, I will be healed. And Yeshua turned, saw her, and said, courage, daughter, your trust has healed you. And she was instantly healed. Now, in both of those passages, we see Yeshua raising a girl from the dead and healing a woman with the issue of blood. Now, think, does Yeshua break the law of Moshe? Can he break the law of Moshe? I don't believe so. No, I believe because he is the law. He is the Torah. And when he was walking on this earth, he had to abide by the same laws that we are to abide by to today. And so in this passages that we just read, Yeshua touched or was touched both by death, because one was someone that was dead, and then the other one, woman with the issue of blood, which was death. So with that, think about this. Was Yeshua defiled or tameh? If we go back to the Torah, which remember he has to abide by the law too, Numbers 19 verse 11 says, anyone who touches a corpse, no matter whose dead body it is, will be unclean for 7 days. In Leviticus 15 and verse 19, it talks about the woman with the issue of blood. If a woman has a discharge and the discharge from her body is blood, she will be in the state of her nidah for 7 days. Okay, she's unclean. But whoever touches her will be unclean until evening. And so he came in contact with death. And therefore, Yeshua had to mikvah. And if you come in contact with death, well, how are you clean? Not only do you mikvah, but you have to be sprinkled with the ashes from the red heifer. And, this causes a lot of people problems because there's a difference between, unclean or tameh and sin. They're not the same thing. You can be tameh or defiled or unclean and not sin. Okay. So it just means that you're not able to go into that holy place. You're not able to, you're not set up, you're going to be set apart because you need to, he can't be in the presence of death here. And so it's about holiness instead of apartness. But what we fail to understand is that this holiness or this set apartness comes with these um, fences, these restrictions. And these restrictions are on how we come into Yah's presence. And we think about it. Holiness is a foundation of our faith. And if we really aren't using it correctly and understanding it correctly, then what does that say about our foundation? And this is one of the things, one of the reasons I think that we really should be looking at too, the book of Leviticus and getting into these types of korbanot, these offerings and Mishkan and studying the Mishkan. And not only that, the temple, what was the service like? So, because in this passage, Yah really explains how man is to approach him. And Yah says, if we go back to the parashah in Exodus 25 and verse 1, Yah said to Moshe, tell the people of Israel to take up a collection for me, accept a contribution from anyone who wholeheartedly wants to give. So Yah is saying that all who have a heart to give could give. But he also says that there were 15 types of materials that were going to be needed for building of the Mishkan. Now, where it says in the version I read, it used the word collection, and that word collection is actually the word terumah. And terumah is written Tav, Resh, Vav, Mem, He. I'll say that again, Tav, Resh, Vav, Mem, He. And the root of the word terumah is room, which means to elevate or to rise or lift up or to exalt. So in this parsha, I was talking about, we are to raise up something. We're to raise up, lift up something. And when you think about too, this word room is also talking about, when you're raising up children. And so what's interesting is that this parashah is linked with the bride. This parashah is the 19th parashah of the year. And so 19 is linked with the bride because Havah, Eve's name, Havah, is numerically 19. Het is 8, Vav is 6, He is 5. So 19 is the bride. And this terumah is, a type of offering. It is not the tithe, okay? And this is a whole nother thing in of itself. But think about this. The building of Yah's house was taken from the offerings that were given, not from the tithe. So I'm not going to go into that, but that's a whole nother thing to think about. As like one girl likes to say, put it in your pocket and you come back to it later. Now, I wanted to go to another passage in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 2. And I'm going to pull this up in a couple of different versions here. Matthew 6, 2. I'm first going to read it in the King James. It says, therefore, when thou dost thine alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward. In the complete Jewish Bible, it reads, so when you do tzedakah, do not announce it with trumpets to win people's praise like the hypocrites in the synagogue and on the streets. Yes, I tell you, they will have their reward already. Now, in modern Hebrew, this word tzedakah, and a lot of times if you go into a synagogue or a Messianic synagogue, you will see a box that has tzedakah on it. And this is for charitable giving. And when you start really looking, this word, has a biblical basis, but we don't really see it used in the Tanakh. But where this word comes from is Zedek, which is righteous. The righteous, a Zedek is a righteous person. So it's based on Zedek or righteous judgment system. And so when we go back into the Torah, we can see something similar, like when you're giving this charitable giving, these alms or charitable giving, what we see that compared to in the Torah is a terumah. And, I think Yah does things on purpose at times to try to get our attention, but there's like a play on words. And I think he does this numerous times, is that there's a play on words here because terumah is very close to the word teruah. And teruah is the sound on the shofar. And a lot of times, if you look at the English, the shofar is translated as a trumpet. So if we go back to Matthew 6 and verse 2 and look at this verse again, it says, therefore, when you give a terumah, don't sound like a teruah before you as the hypocrites do. And I think he's doing a play on words there because, if you're giving a terumah, in the temple, you're most of the time you might be bringing in coins or stuff. And actually they had like these, I don't want to say these vases that were smaller, that they were larger at the top and then they come down smaller and then they got bigger at the bottom. And, you could tell how many coins people dropped in because it's making a clanking noise as it's going down. And that's what he was saying, that, when you give your terumah, don't make a big show so that it makes all those noise that like the hypocrites do so that everybody knows, oh, they gave a lot of coins. So he says, don't make your terumah be a teruah. Don't make your offering be a trumpet blast so that everybody else around you is going to know, oh, this person gave a lot more than someone else. Because you think about in the story in the Brit Hadashah, the widow who gave everything, the widow's mite, and he glorified her. He raised her up. He was exalting her, even though she had little to give. Her terumah wouldn't make a blast. It's not going to make a loud noise, but yet we still read about her today. Now, let's go back to the parsha, and I want to look at verse 8. It says, therefore, you are to make me a sanctuary so that I may live among you. That word sanctuary is mikdash. And you are to make it according to everything I show you. The design of the tabernacle, that's the word Mishkan, and the design of its furnishings. This is how you are to make it. And so what's interesting to me is that in those two verses, Israel is told to make a mikdash, but it's also called a mishkan. And, mikdash, is that word that's translated as sanctuary, but a mishkan is the word that's translated as tabernacle. And by looking at the two words, we sort of get a greater meaning here because mikdash has it as its root Kadash, which is to be set apart or holy. And then Shakan is the root of the word Mishkan, which is dwell. And so, and it's also the word, the root of the word Shakin, which is the word for neighbor. So in essence, the Torah is telling us that Yah is seeking for Israel, his bride, to build a set apart place so that he could dwell and basically be in the neighbor to them. And think about what Yah is telling us. He loves us so much that he wants to live right there with us. And the giving for this, for the building of this, was done from the heart. And this is reflecting, Yah's, the heart of Yah, then his relationship with his people. He didn't want his dwelling place to be constructed with, okay, you have to do this. Or, he's coercing you to do this. You're forced to do it. No, he said that the offering had to be given willingly. You have to want him as much as he wants you. Now, in the Hebrew, that word is, let me see where I can find it. Oh, here it is. Yivenu. And at the root of that is the word nadav, which means to volunteer or to be willing or noble or to be generous. So Yah is wanting his bride to be generous, to want their husband to have a dwelling place. And I was listening this week to Rabbi Foreman, and he was discussing the building of the Mishkan. And, one thing he pointed out was that, you know, when we are building the Mishkan, we're actually emulating Yah, because Yah created the whole universe. He created everything in the universe. And what did he do? He made a little place for us to dwell in this big, vast universe. And so when Israel is building the Mishkan, then basically we're being like him. We are making a place in our world for Yah to dwell. Now, as we continue on in chapter 25, we can see the articles and description. And another thing that stuck out to me here is, you get lots of details. And if you're not detail oriented here, this is just like very boring. But one thing that stands out in the details of this building, it got me to thinking about, okay, if you're building a house and you tend to start with, the foundation, and then you have this outside framework, and then you work your way inward. You're eventually going to put up the walls, and then you're going to put the furnishings in last. And yet that's not the layout that Yah does. When he gives them these commands, Yah starts on the inside with the articles, and he works his way outward. And remember, I think that this is not only a picture of the physical, but it's also a picture of the spiritual, because, if you think about, we are the temple, and that Yah begins on our inside, our heart, and then he works on the outward appearance. So what article then is the heart of the Mishkan or the temple? It begins with the Aron, the ark. And this is where Yah Shekinah will dwell. So let's go to chapter 25, Exodus 25, and I'm going to go down to verse 10. They are to make an ark, an Aron, of acacia wood, 3.75 feet long, 2.25 feet wide, and 2.25 feet high. You are to overlay it with pure gold, overlay both inside and outside, and put a molding of gold around the top of it. Cast 4 gold rings for it and attach them to its 4 feet, 2 rings on each side. Make poles of acacia wood and overlay them with gold. Put the poles into the rings on the sides of the ark. You will use them to carry the ark. The poles are to remain in the rings of the ark, and they are not to be removed from it. Into the ark you are to put the testimony, which I'm about to give. So that, word for ark is the word aron. And the root of the word aron is ara, which means to gather. And this ark was made out of acacia wood. And, one thing to know about the acacia wood is it's very hard, very heavy wood. And it's often called indestructible wood because it often resists rots. And the acacia tree is not a very, very tall tree, but it has these roots that grow very, very deep because it's in the wilderness environment, the Middle East, and it needs these deep roots to grow, to get the nourishment, to get the water deep in the earth, and it survives very well in dry ground. And when you look at this tree, it's not really a beautiful tree like the cedars of Lebanon or a sycamore tree or something like that. It's not really gorgeous on the outside. And this wood, when we think about wood, we've got to remember, the wood comes from a tree, and a tree is a picture of humanity. So what does this tell us about the Aron? That this Aron, this ark is going to do what? It is going to hold the word. They're going to put the word in there. And that this is the heart of the Mishkan. And this ark is actually, when they're, traveling in the wilderness, they actually have the articles and stuff in the center of the tribes as they're going out. But when you see what is at the forefront, in Joshua chapter 3 and verse 3, Joshua 3:3, and it says, he gave the people these orders. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of Yah your Elohim and the Kohanim, who are the Levi'im carrying, you are to leave your position and follow it. So the people followed the Ark. The Ark is at the front. So if you think about, too, this is a picture of your heart. What are you following? Who are you following? Looking at your actions. Are your actions lining up with the word, with Torah? Is it a picture of you following the word when people look at you? Is that what they see? And two, originally, if you go back and think, where did the heart of Yah reside originally? Here with man. It was back in the Garden of Eden. And let's go back to the garden a minute. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 10. And since we're thinking about the heart here, it says, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and there it divided in four streams. So the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, was the heart, and out of the heart flowed these four rivers. And, Yeshua told us in the Brit Hadashah in John chapter 7, verse 38, whoever puts his trust in me, as the scriptures say, rivers of living water will flow out from his innermost being. And so Yeshua tells us that these rivers of living water are going to flow out of you. And two, in 2 Peter 1 and 13, he tells us that, and I consider it right to keep stirring you up with reminders as long as I'm in the tent or the tabernacle of this body. Our body is a tabernacle here. And he says, I know that one day I'm going to lay aside this tent of mine, as Yeshua, the Mashiach, has made it clear to me. And so our body is a tabernacle. So if you think about, okay, our body is a tabernacle. And if our heart is a picture of their own, and then we go back to the Garden of Eden, that the heart, it says that their own, that there's this, that in the garden, that four rivers are going to flow forth. So we think about our heart. Well, our heart, our aroma, has four chambers, but it also has four rivers. The mitral valve and the tricuspid valve, which controls the blood flow from the atria to the ventricles. And then you have the aortic and the pulmonary valve, which control the blood flow out of the ventricles. And so I just Googled a picture of the inside of a heart, and I'm going to share this with you here just so that you can see. Share. Right one to share, sorry. For some reason, it's not wanting to pull that up. Let's try that one more time. There it goes. Okay, so here's just a picture of my notes, and I put the picture of the heart there. So inside the heart, so when you look at this picture of the heart, this is where I noticed something extraordinary. One, not only do you see the Hebrew letter Shin, which is the letter for El Shaddai, which is his name, part of his name on our heart, but the heart in your body is not straight up and down. It's not, it's actually at a slight angle. And if you think about this, well, what does this Aron do? Here's a picture of a baby, and you can see the heart inside there is at the slight angle. And remember, this Ron is what holds the word. And what else, if you think about what else holds the word? And if you're coming into someone's house, a mezuzah. And if you think about how the mezuzah is attached to a doorpost, and here's just a picture of a mezuzah. Look at this. It's at the same angle of the heart in the body. Because why? Not only is your body to be a temple, but your home is to be like a temple. And that Aron, it was made of wood. It's displaying our humanity. But that wood was overlaid with gold. And a gold is a picture of divinity. And so the outside is to appear like gold or like Yah. And many focus only on the outside appearance and being godly and looking godly or whatever. But Yah wasn't worried just about what was on the outside. He started with what's on the inside. So not only is the outside to be covered with gold, but the inside of us is to be covered with gold. We are to be like him and focusing like him. And even Yeshua says something similar in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 27. He's talking to the Torah teachers, the Pharisees. And it says, "Woe to you, hypocritical Torah teachers and Parashim. You are like whitewashed tombs. You look fine on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead people's bones and all kinds of rottenness. Likewise, you appear to people from the outside to be good and honest, but inwardly you are full of hypocrisy and far from the Torah." And so Yeshua is telling them, that you project yourselves a certain way. Think about those people that that might have project themselves, and people around them are looking, oh, they're such a godly person, or they're such a, such a righteous person, they're such a holy person. But on the inside, they're really a tomb or dead, because their inside does not like that. People who are really around them know that's not, that their life and their outside appearance doesn't look the same. Now, I did want to go back to 25 verse 8 a minute, because I thought about something. Wait a second. Okay. In 25, verse 8, it says, "And let them make for me a mikdash, that I may dwell among them." Okay. Yeah. And then if you look at that in the Hebrew, it's Va'asu li mikdash ve'shakanti be'tokam. And what's interesting here is it says that he wants to dwell in them, be'tokam, not in it. So, Yah is desiring to dwell in each of us. And, we think about, well, our body, though, is like a Mishkan. The Mishkan was temporary. It wasn't a permanent, place, and he wants to dwell in us. But Yah wants to dwell in the permanent part of us. And he also says that mikdash, that, set apart place. Well, the permanent part of us, the ruach, our spirit being, that's where he wants to dwell. And so, think about, just as we go about, literally feeding our Mishkan, eating of his, eating to keep our bodies, our temporary dwelling going and being healthy. But we really should be more about feeding our Ruach, our Mikdash, the permanent part of us, what's going to last after we die. Okay. That's the part we really need to be focusing on. Now, one last thing on the Aron here in verse 16, Exodus 25:16. "And you shall put into the Aron the edut, the testimony, which I shall give to you." So this is going to hold the tablets, the word. And this word is to be a testimony, edut. It comes from the word idah, meaning, and even the congregation is called an idah. We're to be a testimony of him. And so what should we be placing in our hearts is his word. That's going back to just, feeding the physical every day. But are you feeding the Ruach every day? Are you in his word every day? And there's a difference between being in his word and reading your devotional and just, oh yeah, just to check the box, I read it. But are you really taking it in? Is it really sustaining you for that day? Are you really focusing on it? And to be honest, a lot of times I'm guilty of that myself, where I'm going through my devotional and I just, okay, I just check off, yeah, I read this, and then just to check the box. But am I taking the time every day to say, okay, y'all, speak to my heart, really, looking and diving into his word and getting that time alone with him, and just focusing on him. I mean, we do that with a meal. We'll sit down and enjoy a meal for 30 minutes. Do you do the same with y'all? Um, even Yeshua says in Matthew 4:4 that the Tanakh says man doesn't live by bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of Yah, which actually Yeshua is quoting Deuteronomy chapter 8 in verse 3, where he says, he humbled you and allowed you to become hungry. And then he fed you with manna, which neither you or your ancestors have ever known, to make you understand that a person does not live on food alone, but on everything that comes out of the mouth of Yah. So again, it's taking that time with Yah every day, showing him that we want him as that husband. We want to spend that time with him. We want him to be like our neighbor and to have that place of dwelling. And not just right next door, but inside of us. And, like I said, the word was placed in the written form into the ark. And, it literally was placed in the written form in the ark. But the prophets also say this, and I want to go to a couple passages here. Jeremiah 31, and you remember sometimes the numberings may be off depending on which version of the scriptures you are using. But Jeremiah 31, verse 32. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yah. I will put my Torah within them and write it on their hearts. I will be their Elohim, and they will be my people. In Psalms verse 40, or chapter 40, verse 9. Psalms 40, verse 9. Doing your will, my Elohim, is my joy. Your Torah is my innermost being. Ezekiel 11:19. And I will give them unity of heart. I will put a new spirit among them, and I will remove from their bodies the hearts of stone, and I will give them hearts of flesh, so that they will live by my regulations, obey my rulings, and act by them. Then they will be my people, and I will be their Elohim. And then one of my favorites is in Psalms 119, verse 11. Which is in my heart I've hidden, so that I will, the word of the Lord, so I won't sin against you. But the version here I'm reading says, I treasure your word in my heart so that I won't sin against you. So are we really putting those things in our heart? And true freedom comes from obedience to his word. Freedom's not abandoning his word, because that's anarchy. But in here, Yah is about building his Mishkan from the inside out. He starts with your heart, and we must start with our heart. And notice too that in this ark, this Aron, that he says that two poles were placed on the sides of the ark to carry it. They were not to be removed. And this is, symbolizing the mobility of the ark, because we must be ready to move as the Ruach leads. We must be ready to go, just like the ark. They had to be ready, when the ark moved, they had to be ready to follow it. And those two poles were made of wood again. So I see this as a picture of, you got these two trees, these two people, these two witnesses, these two houses are carrying the word. They're moving as the Ruach leads. And, I see this as a picture of the whole house of Israel, that this is the house of Yehuda and the house of Ephraim. And they're spiritually carrying the Ruach. They are witnesses and moving as this Ruach leads them. Just like when Joseph died in Egypt, his bones were to be carried out. And, it was carried out by the whole house, the two houses of Israel, these two poles. And, Joseph is a picture of Yeshua. Now, let's go back to Exodus 25 and verse 12 again. And it says, cast 4 gold rings for it and attach them to its 4 feet, 2 rings on each side. Make poles of acacia wood, overlay them with gold, put the poles in the rings on the sides of the ark, and you are to use them to carry the ark. The poles are to remain in the rings of the ark. They are not to be removed from it. Into the ark you are to put the testimony which I give to you. So if you look at verse 13 there, it actually in the Hebrew says, Ve'asita b'dei adzei shittim. That's the acacia. Shittim is the acacia. Ve'zepita otam zahav. Okay. And b'dei is that word for poles. But b'dei also means alone or apart or separation. And like I said, that word shittim means, it's the word for the acacia tree, but shittim at the root also means to scourge or to pierce. So as I was looking at this, I see that, you shall make these separated trees, these trees of separation that are what? That are pierced. Well, we are trees. And there were 2 pierced trees that are separated. What is this? It's talking about, I think, the 2 houses that are separated. And notice that in verse 15 it says, that they're going to be in rings, that these 2 trees, these 2 houses are both going to be in rings. And that word ring is tabat, which means like a signet ring. And I've talked before about what is the sign that we are his is the Shabbat. It's, how do you know you're married? What's the sign? That wedding ring. And that the Shabbat is that ring. And so both houses here are placed in these rings and they should not be removed from it. And so you're looking at this, what is this saying? This is saying that these 2 witnesses that are carrying the word of Yah, that are being led by the Ruach and are going from place to place, they're both honoring Shabbat. And they cannot be removed from that. That this is another reason why Shabbat is so important. Now, that's to me just a beautiful picture just in that of itself. And, a lot of times, in Exodus 25, verse 17, it talks about you were to make a cover for the ark out of pure gold. And a lot of times we see this called a mercy seat. But what's interesting is you look at the Hebrew, it doesn't say mercy there, and it doesn't even say the word seat there. Okay. It says you are to make a cover for the ark out of pure gold. It is to be 3 3/4 feet long, 2 1/4 feet high. You're to make 2 cherubim of gold and make them of hammer gold for the 2 ends of the ark cover. Make 1 of cherub for one end and 1 cherub for the other end, and make the cherubim of one piece with the ark cover at 2 ends. And the cherubim will have their wings spread out above so that their wings cover the ark and their faces toward each other toward the ark cover. You are to put the ark cover on top of the ark, and inside the ark you are to put the testimony that I'm about to give to you. There I will meet with you. I will speak with you from above the ark cover, from between the 2 cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, about all of the orders I'm giving you for the people of Israel. And so, like I said, that word, that cover, that's in English is often translated as mercy seat, is actually the word kaparet. And kaparet has as its root kafar, which means atonement. And the kaparet, or this atonement cover, was to be placed over the word that is in the ark. And so think about the aron of our Mishkan is, the Aron is the heart. And so we think about the Kaparet, this covering, this atonement cover, is to be applied to our heart. This is where, the blood would, we're to apply the blood on our heart. Our heart is to be covered with that atonement, and that's where we should have it applied. And notice too that it says that there were two cherubim, and these aren't the little fat little baby pictures. These little babies with flying wings. No, there were two of them here, and they represent these two witnesses, because what are they doing? They are there guarding the word. And when we go back to where we see these two cherubim, it takes us all the way back again to the garden. And I think that's what Yah is trying to do. He is trying to restore us to that relationship that he had with man in the garden. And people say, oh, well, we don't really have a tabernacle or a Mishkan in the garden. I disagree. I think we do. The Mishkan, because it is Yah's dwelling place. It is in the garden here. So I'm going to show you a picture, and I found this one online. Just a second. Let me go right here, and I'm going to share this picture of the Mishkan. Okay, so this is just a picture of the Mishkan. And so you can see, how everything's laid out. Now, I don't necessarily agree with everything as it's labeled here on the picture, but I do think it's a good picture of the layout of the articles. Here, notice we've got a veil here. I don't think that is the middle wall of partition. So that is something I disagree with there, but there is a veil here, there is a veil there, and there is a veil here. And so each one of these veils, I do believe, and more later when the temple was built during the Second Temple time, that they were called the way, the truth, and the life. And so there were three veils here. So like I said, there was a veil to the Holy of Holies, there's a veil to the holy place, and then there's a veil here to the court of Israel. And so, and if you notice in this picture too, it outlines this is where the Gentiles could be. They could not come in here. This is where you have the altar of burnt offering, the altar, the laver. You also have the table of showbread, the altar of incense, the menorah. And then you had, going through this veil, you have the ark, the Aron, and actually this one spread it out so you could see what was inside. On top of the ark is the Kaparet, which is the mercy seat. And then you had the rod. You also have the word inside there, and then you would have the pot and manna. So that's just an illustration. But one of the things, as you're going through that, you think about that it really had three sections, okay? And as you pass through each section and you're getting closer and closer into Yah's presence, and you could only enter through these veils that were on the east, okay? And as you pass through, you're getting closer and closer to Yah's presence. There was a higher level of holiness, and there were less and less people that were allowed in each section. And, we hear a lot about the outer court and the inner court, but I think many people, and I've seen lots of illustrations here that I believe that don't really label them correctly. And many people fail to understand exactly where they're located. So the outer court is actually the area where the court of Israel was. That was where you had the altar, and you had the laver. Okay. And when you think about, the outer court would be the area outside of that area of the court of Israel. So when you think about the court of Israel, sorry, did I just say that wrong? Yes, I did. Sorry. The court of Israel, where the altar and the laver are, that's the inner court. The outer court is actually that court out there were the court of the Gentiles. Okay. So when we think about that, because see, I have to retrain my brain to think way, because when you look at those pictures, they label them incorrectly. That in that outer court, that is the court of the Gentiles, is what they call it, because the court of the nations, because in that area, all people were allowed to come in that outer court. The inner court, where that is the court, what they call the court of Israel, that's where the laver and the altar are located. And in that courtyard, only the Leviim and the Kohanim. Now, the Leviim could come into that area, but they weren't allowed to touch or go near the altar or the laver. And a lot of times, remember, the Levites would stand on the sides, and they were the worshipers. They were the ones that were praising and doing musical instruments. So the Leviim could come in that area, and they could be along the sides with the worship. But the Kohanim were the only ones that were allowed to go up to the altar into the holy place. And then when you go into the holy place, only the Kohanim were allowed to go into the holy place. And that's where the table of showbread, the altar of incense, and the menorah were located. Okay. So they could go into that area. But then we go through that other veil, which is where the Holy of Holies was, and it even got even smaller. Only the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, could go into there. And he could only go in there one time a year. And that was on Yom Kippur. So think about this. When you have the outer court, the court of the Gentiles, everybody's there. You go through to the court of Israel, the inner court, where the altar and the labor are. You could have the Kohanim and Leviim. But the Kohanim could only get near the altar and the laver, and the Kohanim were the ones that could only go into the holy place. And then when you get into the holy place, only the Kohen Gadol could go into the Holy of Holies, and only one time a year. So there were restrictions as to who could go where and when they could go. And, typically we think of, okay, the high priest, when we think about his garments and all the, the colorful garments that he's wearing with all the colors. And and I was even taught, the bells on the bottom, the pomegranates, and then you have these bells on the bottom. And that the reason they had the bells there were because as this high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, that if they were, not atoning for themselves, they had sin or whatever, that Yah would strike them down in his presence, and they would have to be pulled out of the Holy of Holies. Okay? Because nobody else could go in there. That's what I was taught. Even in the Messianics, I was taught that. But wait a second. Let's look at what the word says. Let's go back to Leviticus 16 and verse 3. It says, "Here is how Aaron is to enter the holy place. With a young bull as a sin offering and a ram as a burnt offering. He is to put on his holy linen tunic, have the linen shorts next to his bare flesh, have the linen sash wrapped around him, and be wearing the linen turban. They are his holy garments. He is to put them on. He is to bathe his body in water and put them on." And so when we start going through and you're starting to look at Yom Kippur, when the one time a year when he could go in there, what is he wearing when he goes into the Holy of Holies? It is only the linen garments. He isn't wearing these other garments when he would go in there. He is only wearing those linen garments on Yom Kippur. Now, going back to the layout of the tabernacle, you think about, they could only enter from the east. These veils were open to the east. They could only enter to the east. So as they were coming in, they're walking toward the west. And, I believe, like I said earlier, that this pattern, this layout is the same that we see in the garden. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 8. It says, "They heard the voice of Yah, Elohim, walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. So man and his wife hid themselves in the presence of Yah among the trees in the garden. Okay, so this phrase, at the time of the evening breeze, or some versions say the cool of the day, is actually talking about temple language. It's the language that is used in temple times later, much later. And this is the time when the setting of the sun was getting lower and the cool breezes coming off from the Mediterranean would come in. And this is the time in the temple days, what would be called Marav, which is the time of the evening sacrifice. And so when Adam and Eve, they're walking in the garden, and when do they hear Yah's voice? It's at the time of the evening sacrifice. And when they sinned, what happens? The area of this tree of life becomes off limits for them. And I think this parallels what is referring to as the Holy of Holies. Now, I'm not 100% sure if the tree of knowledge of good and evil was in that area, but I tend to think about the wheat and the tares, because the wheat and the tares will grow together. And we know that these tares, I see the tree of knowledge of good and evil as being like this tare that was planted by the enemy. In Genesis 3:22, Yah Elohim said, "See, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now, to prevent his putting out his hand and taking also from the tree of life and eating and living forever, therefore Yah Elohim sent him out of the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken. So he drove the man out, and he placed him at the east of the Garden of Eden, the cherubim, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden the cherubim and a flaming sword which turned in every direction to guard the way to the tree of life." Now, notice that the cherubim were placed at the east of the Garden of Eden, and the cherubim were guarding this east entrance, this gate into the garden here. And it is forbidding anyone else to enter. And again, I think this picture parallels, or, if it parallels the layout of the Mishkan, well, what about these other items? Because, okay, where are they? Do we see those in the Garden of Eden? Well, first, okay, I believe there is a difference between Eden and the Garden of Eden. Just like, okay, we live in a city in a certain state. And so if we think about the garden being like the city and Eden being like the state, I believe that Adam and Havah could still be in Eden, but they were forbidden to enter the garden. And, going back up to where I read, he said, in verse 23, 3:23, it says, "Therefore Yah Elohim sent him out of the Garden of Eden to cultivate the ground from which he was taken." So I still see that as, okay, this is the area from which he was still taken. This is still Eden, but he's cultivating the ground there. But they were forbidden to enter the garden. Now, we know, of course, that, Adam and Eve go on to have children. Let's go over to chapter 4. In chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "In the course of time, Cain brought an offering to Yah from the produce of the soil, and Havel too brought from the firstborn of his sheep, including their fat. And Yah accepted Havel his offering, but did not accept Cain and his offering. Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And Yah said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why so downcast? If you're doing what is good, shouldn't you hold your head high? And if you don't do what is good, sin is crouching at the door. It wants you, but you can rule over it.' And Cain had words with Havel his brother. Then one time when they were in the field, Cain turned on Havel his brother and killed him." So we know, in this first part here, that it starts in verse 3 that in the course of time, Cain, and Havel, Abel, brought these offerings. And, it seemed like it's a random time. But again, that phrase is related to the temple service. If we go back to when they were bringing offerings in the temple, if we go to Exodus chapter 23 and verse 14. 3 times a year you are to observe a festival for me. Keep the festival of matzah for 7 days, as I ordered you. You are to eat matzah at the time determined in the month of Aviv, for it was in that month that you left Egypt. No one is to appear before me empty-handed. Next, the festival of the harvest, the first fruits of your efforts sowing in the field. And last, the festival of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather from the fields the results of your efforts. 3 times a year, all of your men are to appear before the Lord. Yeah. So 3 times a year, they were to bring these specific offerings. And one of these was Sukkot. And Sukkot, here in the version I was reading, is referred to as the Feast of Ingathering. But it's also described as a festival of the harvest, because it says, what are they doing here? They are bringing the harvest. And the word that's used to the Hebrew word that's used to describe the time when Cain and Abel brought their offerings, which says in the course of time, and it's actually at the word course there is actually ketz at the end. And when you look here, it is at the end of the season, or the festival of ingathering, or Sukkot, which is at the end at ketz, when they were doing that. And so when you think about when they were bringing the offering, and when later Israel was commanded to bring the offering, I believe are linked together. Cain and Abel knew when to bring an offering, and I believe they knew what to bring and where to bring it. And, similarly, Israel is told what to bring, when to bring it, and where to bring it. And all these sacrificial offerings could only be presented at the temple, or the Mishkan, later the temple. In Deuteronomy chapter 16, and this is just one place, it says in verse 5, talking about the Passover offering here, this is the offering, you may not sacrifice it in just any of the towns that Yah your Elohim is giving you, but at a place where Yah your Elohim would choose to have his name live. This is where you are to sacrifice the Pesach offering in the evening when the sun sets at the time of year that you came out of Egypt. If you go on down in verse 11, it says, you are to rejoice in the presence of Yah your Elohim, you, your sons, your daughters, your male, your female slaves, the Levi'im living in your towns, the foreigners, the orphans, and widows living among you, in the place where Yah your Elohim would choose for his name to live. So nowhere else. They couldn't do it in Dan. They couldn't do it, they tried to do it there. They, tried to offer in other places. And he's like, no, this is not where you could not bring it anywhere. You can't do it in Tel Aviv. Nowhere else could they bring these offerings but to the Mishkan and the temple. And so with Cain and Abel, I believe the same was true. I believe that, so they, went to the area where they knew Yah dwelt, because just like he tells the children of Israel later, you can only do it where I dwell. Well, where did Yah dwell? Cain and Abel knew that Yah dwelt in the garden, but they could not get back into the garden. And so what did they do? They built the altar as close as possible to the entrance to the garden. So if we go back to the layout of the garden, then I want to, in the Mishkan, I want to share this with you. So taking that same picture that I used before for the Mishkan and changing it, this is the garden, okay? So when we look at that, like I said, that pattern, let me slide that up a little bit. So as we're looking at that picture there, I believe there are other patterns of temple language, that's also used in the story of Genesis and Bereshit that also revolves around the Mishkan and the temple. But when you think about, okay, so the garden in which Adam and Eve were placed was represented by this whole area of the holy place, okay, which only the Kohanim could enter. Well, what was, Adam? He was a Cohen, and Eve, they are one. They're one flesh. So here we've got them in the garden, this area. But, when Shlomo built the temple at Jerusalem, it's interesting when you start looking at how he decorated it. He decorated the outside and the inside walls of the temple, of the holy place, in a way that made it look like the garden. So, now thinking about Cain here, and here I've got like the tree of life, but I also have, remember, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because it's like a picture of the wheat and the tares. And then the two cherubim I've got here blocking the way to the garden. And then, I have this outer, this area here, which is actually the inner court, the outer court's over here. But remember that Cain was cut off from Yah and he wandered. And the mark, he was, marked to show that he wasn't really completely forgotten there. And I want to go back to that in a minute. So he was marked. Let me go there. In Genesis chapter 4 and verse 15, Yah answered him, therefore, whoever kills Cain will receive vengeance sevenfold. And Yah put a sign on Cain so that no one would kill him. So that this mark was actually like a mark of protection. It was showing, you're not completely forgotten. And I believe that, Cain is representing like the Gentiles, those, who would be considered like the Gentiles. And I personally believe that the temple that was built in Jerusalem was actually built in the same place as the original in the Garden of Eden. And that's another teaching that I've done on Eden. But, on a side note, when you think about that veil, that was rent at Yeshua's death, when you go back and you look at the second temple time period, there was a Babylonian veil that covered the door of the holy place. And remember how I said that those three veils, one is called the way, the truth, and the life. And so when you look at that veil that was covering the door of the holy place is a Babylonian veil. And I believe that this parallels the veil that we see in the Garden of Eden that had the cherubim with these flaming swords on it that are blocking the entrance into the holy place. Things cycle around. Yah has this cherubim with these flaming swords that are blocking the entrance to the holy place. But then you also have this Babylonian veil in the second temple time that's covering this truth. In Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14, it says, for he himself is our shalom, talking about Yeshua. He has made us both one and has broken down the partition which has divided us by destroying his own body, the enmity occasioned by the Torah, with its commands set forth in the form of ordinances. He did this in order to create a union with himself from the two groups into a single new humanities, one new man, and thus make us peace. So he's removing this veil, so that the truth could be revealed. And it was restoring the one new man. And so this is meant that the Gentiles who were, in a state of wandering and being without any, spiritual home, they were away from Yah, which is the same thing that happened to Cain. Cain was wandering and he was sent out and he didn't have this spiritual link to Yah, but there is a way for them to come back. And it was similar to that they could come to the court of Israel. This is getting them back into that, because he's saying that veil is rent, that they now can have access. They can get to this holy altar here. And then not only that holy altar, but they are, in this place where the truth can be revealed. And this truth is that one new man is consisting of both what was considered Jew and Gentile. And so, I see this as this Mishkan is in the garden. It's also, in later when he's requiring the children of Israel to make him a house, build him a house. Now, one thing I didn't mention is, in the garden, though, and when we looked at the holy place there, we didn't see the table of showbread. We didn't see the menorah. We didn't see the altar of incense. Well, why? Because I believe that Yeshua here in the garden, he is the menorah. He is the light. He is the table bread. He is that bread of life. He is the intercessor, the prayers. He is the one that is accepting the prayers there. So he is there. So it's not that you don't see those articles in there. I think that he's there. It's him. Now, going back to that beginning word of Terumah, that offering, I believe it's also a picture of the Mashiach. When we look at the word Terumah, and I spelled that out earlier, it's the Tav Vav. Sorry, I just went Tav Vav Resh Nimhe. What's interesting is, because I was thinking about the word Torah, is the word Torah, Tav Vav Resh He, has the exact same letters. The only difference is between that and Terumah is one letter, which is the mem. The mem is put with that. Well, what is the mem? Mem is also the water, but mem is the number 40, which is testing. So what is the Torah tested? The Torah tested is what built the Mishkan. It is, testing your heart to see, are you offering to Yah? Do you choose him? Do you choose to build a place for him to reside, not only physically, but are you choosing to do that spiritually in your heart? So, putting this all together, the bride is to bring this terumah that is given freely. And your heart is to be set on searching out the Torah in order that we would become fruitful and we're going to raise up a godly seed. And you remember in Exodus 25, he says that back in verse 9, he says that, you're going to do this after the pattern that I show you. He's telling Moshe, you're going to do this after the pattern that I show you. And that this pattern, the Mishkan was to be built after the pattern. Where's the pattern come from? The pattern is coming from the heavenly Mishkan. And, this Mishkan there, is the pattern, but the whole place was the Mikdash, the dwelling place. And, I believe like Moshe was shown the real tabernacle on the mountain, and that, Yah was just, like they said, giving him this download and showing him how to instruct everything here and how to make it on earth like it is in heaven. And remember in, the Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6, he says, our Father who art in heaven, your name be set apart. May your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so, think about, he's saying, even in the Lord's Prayer, he's saying, this is the pattern up there. We're trying to get this to look like that. And back in Exodus 25 too, he says, you're going to make it after this pattern that I showed you on the mountain. Now that word for pattern is the word tavnit, which means like a form or likeness or a figure or pattern. But tavnit at the root of it is the word banah. Remember the bait and the vait are actually the same letters, just one has the dot, one does not, but it's the same letter. It's like a lot of times a B and a V, and I think Spanish is also interchangeable. So the root is the word banah, and banah means to build. So you think about what's happening. They're building something, but The root of the word bana is the word bin, which is the word son. So what are they about building is the Son. The Son is the pattern. The Son, Yeshua, is Mashiach, is the pattern. He's the likeness of the Father. So the pattern is the Son, is Yeshua. And remember that Yeshua even says in John chapter 12, verse 32, if I am lifted up, well, what is that lifting up? That is the Terumah. If I am lifted up, that I shall draw men unto me. And so that lifting up, that terumah, Yeshua is our terumah. He is our terumah. He is our offering that we're giving to build that tabernacle in our hearts. And, why are so many details when you start looking are given to the building of the tabernacle? It's because the tabernacle is fashioned, it's patterned after the Mashiach. And to build the tabernacle is emulating Yah. It is, emulating him so that we can have the dwelling of his Ruach in us. And that, any man that has that spirit of Yah dwelling in him, is called, I believe Israel. He's, doing Yah's words. He's trying to live close to Yah. So, that's just really what I wanted to share with you. It's mostly just chapter 25. I didn't go into the other articles this time, but really thinking about righteousness and understanding what this Mishkan is and how it's leading us all the way back to the garden. And, I just pray today that your heart, that your life is emulating the fact that you are choosing him. Are you longing for Yah so much that you want him to literally be your neighbor, to be right there with you, but not only to be your neighbor, but to be closer than that neighbor and to be in your heart? So like I said, I wanted to get this out before, since we're having our gathering, and just, I thought hopefully this will touch you too. So Shabbat Shalom, and then I will see you next week.